Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Free to Grow CFO podcast, where we dive deep into conversations about scaling a profitable D2C brand. I'm your host, Jon Blair, founder of Free to Grow CFO. We're the go-to outsourced finance and accounting firm for 8 and 9-figure D2C brands. And today, I'm stoked to be chatting with my buddy Ben Tregoe, founder of Elephant Herd. Elephant Herd is a consulting firm that provides performance finance consulting for e-commerce brands. Ben,
John,
thanks for
great to
joining,
be
man.
here.
How's it going? Man, it looks beautiful behind you.
I'm outside Boston and we're having a really slow spring. So it's like the first day it hasn't rained in 2 weeks, I feel. So
Nice and green out there,
yeah,
man. We're heating up out here in Austin. So, in fact, we were just chatting right before I hit record. Ben is going to be out here in a few days for a big e-com event that Final Loop is throwing. So get ready for the heat. It's going to be, I think, 96, 97
oh my God. Okay.
for the event. Well, I'm excited for today's conversation. What are we going to be talking about? We're going to be breaking down how to extract more cash out of your D2C brand so that you can use it to buy assets and build wealth. This is something I've been talking about a lot more recently. I think here's where this came from, and then we're going to dive into the conversation. We look at the aftermath of like the COVID era of e-com brands, right? During the COVID era, there was like this wild west of like, exiting brands for huge multiples based on revenue, not even EBITDA, this huge asset bubble in e-com, right? Where like you could make life-changing money selling your brand. Is that 100% gone? No, but valuations have reverted to the mean, which is like we're going to value businesses based on their earning and cash flow generating potential, right? But I'm starting to realize that brand founders need to be informed that there's another way to build wealth besides exiting, right? Which is extracting cash out of your business and using that cash to build wealth. And Ben has a wealth of knowledge around this. It's very tied into what he's doing at Elephant Herd. So I'm excited to get into chatting about this because, in my opinion, brand founders should be looking at extracting distributions on a monthly or quarterly basis as the primary form of building wealth. And obviously, if they can sell down the line, perfect, but that's a cherry on top. So, to get started, Ben, walk us through briefly your entrepreneurial background and your journey to ultimately starting Elephant Herd.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. I started in investment banking in New York, then worked for an in-house fund at Lazard Frere, realized that life wasn't for me, took a detour to LA where I was in entertainment for a brief time as a TV writer at Disney. And then came out of that and I was like, I don't want to do that either. And I got into startups and I was like, oh, this is awesome. I just loved it. So I've been doing startups for the past 25 years, had a failure, a couple successes. I've been in the seat. I know how hard it is. I've done stuff in e-com and marketing tech and ad tech. Most recently, I was the founding CEO of a company called DrivePoint, which provides FP&A software combined with a data warehouse for e-com brands, as well as services. And I left there about 2.5 years ago and just have been doing what I enjoy the most, which is the consulting part to brand founders.
So walk me through just like the nuts and bolts of kind of like the basics of what you're helping brands with over there at Elephant Herd.
Yeah. Well, we call it performance finance. And so what our ideal clients are ones where we can provide 10x value. So we're looking for clients where we can make big enough improvements to their profitability and their cash flow that our fee is 10% of that. And so that's like kind of the performance part. It's like pay for performance finance. So that fits often very well with agencies and fractional CFOs like yourself. So we're coming in and saying like, hey, there's these things that we can do really quickly, and but oftentimes you need a partner to come in and then help you make those, improve the accounting, but also take over, the finance functions after that. So, we're not. It's more short-term projects and rapid progress, and then like, okay, we're on to the next thing. So it's
For sure.
intensive and short-term, and is kind of the key to it.
So, one in doing that work, you talk about how making these like financial performance improvements a lot of times boil down to two main drivers: margins and capital cycles. So let's break that down a little bit. Like when you say, hey, this all boils down to margins and capital cycles, what do you mean?
Well, I've been doing this for a while, right? Like talking to brands, and like what struck me originally is like how complex all this stuff is, right? Like
Yeah.
it's really hard. As a brand founder, I have a lot of empathy. You're international supply chains and logistics and customer support and product development and marketing and performance advertising and finance and running a company on top of that. And I think people get kind of sometimes the complexity overwhelms them. And if you zoom out a little, you realize like, look, your goal as a brand founder is increase, margin dollars, or and or increase your ability to spend capital. As I invest my capital, can I speed it up? And the way I kind of think about this is like, you've got to decide like, are you Hermes, with a 43% EBITDA margin, or are you Costco with a 5% EBITDA margin, but you're
But
spending your
inventory
capital every
turnover like
30 days?
crazy. Yeah. Yeah,
Or are you somewhere in
100%.
between?
For sure. Yeah, it's okay. So it's interesting that you say that because I'm sure you get asked this or have gotten asked this many times, which is like, what should my margin be? So like one of the things I do, I'm a part-time mentor in an e-commerce community called Daily Mentor, and I get the question all the time, like, well, I'm told my margin is too low. What should it be? And I was like, hold on a second here. Like, first off, do we want a higher margin if we have the choice? We definitely want a higher margin, right? But you got to think about how that relates to how quickly you turn inventory a lot of times, right? That like if you have a super like I have some brands that we work with at Free to Grow that maybe have like an 85% gross margin, a super high gross margin, and their inventory turnover is lower and it doesn't cause the problems you think it would because they have such a good margin. So they're turning over a higher margin less times per year. But then you've got, like you said, the Costco example, razor thin margin in comparison, but they are just turning through inventory very fast at a much higher velocity, right? Let's talk through that a little bit more. Like, how does that conversation usually go? Like trying to walk a brand founder through that, and how do you help them kind of understand that relationship and why it's so important?
I think you start with organic free cash flow generation.
Mm,
And so your business has like kind of a natural ability to produce margin and cash cycles, right? Hermes, to use that example, they couldn't get to 30-day inventory and almost 12 turns a year. Like you just can't produce Birkin bags that quickly and sell them, right?
for sure.
That'd be a terrible business model for them. And the flip side is like Costco is famous for like, it's 9% markup. So they can't go out and be like, oh, you know what? I'm going to charge an 85% margin on this, right?
Totally.
So the business model or the kind of industry that you're in, I think determines that. And then you're working up from your free cash flow. So I think, where people get themselves in trouble is the margins are too low. They can't produce enough free cash flow. They try to close the gap with short-term borrowing. And then, it's often a long march to death from there, right? As they get
For
into
sure.
themselves into a debt spiral. So I think you got to say like, okay, what level of organic cash flow do we need in order to get our growth, to be sustainable first and then grow from there? And I think the way you answer the first question of what's sustainable is you got to really understand your customer churn. And so
Mm,
it's like, how much money do I have to put back into my marketing budget just to stay even?
totally.
So,
Totally.
and I'm talking about companies with repeat purchasing dynamics. This isn't like fidget spinners and shit like that, just like
Totally.
you never see the customer again.
Totally. Okay, so a couple things. I want to dive a little bit more into the repeat purchase stuff in a second because I this is something I've been talking about a lot in my content and that we've really kind of been digging deep into at Free to Grow with trying to help our clients understand how that plays into the ability to scale or the speed at which is possible to scale profitably, right? Because I think what we've started to realize is a lot of e-com brands just think because like back in the day, you could be in a nascent e-com product category, launch it, and just totally crush it and not even have to worry about how the dynamics of things like new customer profit versus returning customer
Yeah.
profit worked. There wasn't as much volatility in ad costs, right? But that's just not the environment we live in today. And so, but before we get into that, I want to back up and talk about the cash cycle really fast. So when the cash conversion cycle is something that we work with all of our clients on, and it's some brand founders get it, some brand founders don't understand it, some vaguely understand it. How do you what define cash conversion cycle and like how a brand founder should think about it in just like the simplest terms?
Man, this is like one of those things. I feel your pain because it's like a great finance and accounting term, and like so much in finance and accounting, there's like 90 ways to do it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
for sure.
like, the formulas always look different. And people, the way they explain it is different. So I mean, very technically, it's like days inventory, days sales minus days payable. I think that's kind of useless for most people. So
Totally.
I'm not even going to bother going in there. I think the key is just days inventory. Because
Yeah,
that's really
especially
the
for ecom
problem.
brands, right? Like especially for ecom brands.
Yeah. So let's just focus there because like there's only so much you can do in your payables. At some point, your suppliers are like, I think I'll cut you off, right? So, and you can only force Target to pay you at such speed. So let's focus on inventory. And when you do that, then it's like, is it days inventory or the inverse inventory turnover, right? All you're deciding is like how quickly from when I cut my check or wire my money do I get it back in terms of sales.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's okay. So I there's something that you said that I really like, which is like, okay, let me tell you, brand founder, it's the formula is we use even simpler terms. We just say AR days, inventory days minus AP days. That's the formula. But what is controllable in like what's really controllable, right? The most. And I guess even I would say like what's controllable in like a high leverage way. Cause like you can and should, I always tell brand founders like you should definitely always revisit your payment terms on a regular cadence as you're growing and building trust. But you can't do it an infinite number of times, and there's only so far you can go every single time. You definitely should work on it diligently, but it's going to be oftentimes incremental improvement, right? But the inventory days, especially for an ecom brand, which even if they're omni-channel, tend to have very low receivables relative to how much cash is tied up in inventory. That's really the thing that's taking you from like I cut a check for $1 on day one for inventory, and it takes this many days to get back, right? In the form of cash collected from a sale. So I'm curious, and I'll tell some stories that are kind of like thoughts on my end, but like there I do run into a lot of founders who are like, there's nothing I can do about my inventory days. Or like it feels insurmountable, right? Like it feels really challenging. It feels daunting. Break down just kind of some of the first things that typically come to mind on like, let's look here first, and then let's look here second, and then let's look here third. How does that usually go?
So I think to answer your question, the first thing you got to do is decide. There's some good techniques, right? I think like ABC is a pretty good one to start with, where you class your products by, the A, B, or C, and then you assign days inventory to A, B, or C, right? And then you can say, okay, you can try to get a little more control over it, where you're saying like, okay, I'm going to do 90 days on this, but only 30 days on my C stuff because I don't really know if it's good. So I think that's at least a good start because my experience, like I've yet to run into a brand that's like great at inventory and ordering and really has a process around that.
It's hard.
It's super hard. And I think the problem is, this is a long answer to your question, but I think the problem is that we think about inventory incorrectly. Like we should be thinking about it in terms of bets.
Yes,
And
100%.
you're betting the capital of the company on this inventory. So when you think about it that way, it's kind of like a poker player, right? They're like their goal is to build really good decision systems. So when they're presented with circumstances, they play the hand correctly, but there's always an element of luck. And if the hand doesn't turn out for them, what the good ones do is they say like, okay, well, I made the right decision. It just, I didn't realize that the cards that guy had, right? So I think the same is true of inventory ordering. Like you got to build really good systems and reward those and incentivize those. And then what you want is as you start asking questions, you should be asking and tracking your answers to these questions. So like, who's going to buy this product? Is it my current customers or new customers? How much am I going to have to spend to acquire those customers? And then you want to ask like, how quickly do I get paid back?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can capture that in an IRR calculation. So because you might have different supply chains for your products, you might have different sales velocities of those products. And so you might be like, oh, I'm only buying 90 days of inventory, but it's like, yeah, but you had to cut those checks, 100 days prior to beginning to
Totally.
sell it. So you have this super long period, right? And so your IRRs are going to be worse than the one that had great terms that allow you to start paying them after you started selling, for example. And I think once you build some of the little bit of that discipline and kind of thinking about bets, like how quickly am I really getting this money back? And then tracking how accurate you are to that, you start making better inventory decisions. Like I'm sure you've seen this all the time. Like, founders
Totally.
like, we got to load up on the stuff that sells. And they're like, but I love the purple stuff. And then like, let's really buy a lot of purple.
Totally.
Like now
Well,
we're like,
no.
oh, it's dead inventory. Nobody ever takes responsibility.
So there's a couple things you mentioned. One, I talk all the time about, I call it placing risk adjusted bets, right? And
Yeah.
inventory is a great example because oftentimes there's debt financing tied to it for these e-com brands, right? So how you capitalize the bet also introduces more or less risk into the decision. And so what I could try to help founders understand is like the bigger bet you place, the lower risk there better be, generally speaking, right? Like if there's lower, so going back to the poker hand, when a good poker player, when they go all in, they know that the probability is low, is relatively low that they're going to lose that hand. So they're like, so they go all in when there's low risk of loss, right?
Right.
Now when there's a higher risk of loss, they place smaller bets, right? And that you should be thinking, scaling is actually just a endless series of risk adjusted bets, right? You're placing risk adjusted bets on ad spend and customer acquisition. You're placing risk adjusted bets on purchasing inventory, on hiring new people, capital expenditures if those exist in your business, and that's why a CFO is so important for it. Not just an ecom brand, because ecom is already hard enough and capital intensive, but when you're scaling the risk adjusted bets, there's more at stake. And it can start to get a little challenging to really assess risk in an objective manner, right? And not a subjective manner. And so I actually want to turn to talking about risk adjusted returns. But one thing I did want to mention I thought of when you were talking about inventory is this is something that I've seen brands that we work with that have heavy repeat purchase is when they advertise the availability of stock on their Shopify store, they will actually they'll subtract the next 30 or 60 days, depending on their lead times, of subscription inventory from what is available, with the goal being we can't ever run out of subscription inventory. We can't ever not fill our subscription orders. And that's what I think one thing that I've learned working with a bunch of brands at Free to Grow is like if you have strong repeat purchase, you do need to think really, really, like you really need to protect like not stocking out of your subscription base, right? Because those are your loyal customers that have higher margin dollars per order because you've already spent the ad spend on acquiring them, right? And if you mess that up, it can mess a lot up. But I do want to talk about this is a nice segue into like thinking about the connection between forecasting repeat purchase, returning customers, inventory management, and also thinking about the risk of scaling. So you mentioned something when we were kind of preparing in thinking about like forecasting repeat purchase and connecting that to inventory planning. Like how can understanding the connection of forecasted repeat purchase to inventory planning help brands get smarter about about like the impact of inventory planning on cash flow.
Yeah. Well, look, you're as a brand, you're selling products to people, right? I think too often we get caught in like cohorts and models, and it's just like it's numbers and it's all averages, but it's products to people. And so I think one of the things that I found really useful is to time-based cohorts like, oh, those are my August 2020s and whatever are useful, but it's all averages. What I find more useful is when you look at your customer base as like, how do my new customers purchase? How do my high value customers purchase? And then how does the rest of my, customers purchase? And then if you look at like your high value customers, you can often like, oh, these are the products that they're buying. Like in your previous example, it was like, these are my subscribers, right? So it's like, I think those learnings of like my best customers matched with my products help you, and forcing that into the inventory buying process
Totally.
then forces everybody to kind of answer these questions like, who's going to buy this? Like, what percentage of this buy is going to be consumed by our high value customers and our new customers and then everybody else? And as opposed to being like, well, everybody's buying at like 1.2 orders a month. So like that times, and that's how you over order because
Totally.
you assume everybody's equal and it's not true. It's like, I love this example of Ferrari, right? They only make 14,000 cars a year, hugely profitable, but they make all that money by selling like $3 million cars. They don't make it off of the $200,000 or $300,000 Ferraris, right? So they don't go and build a $3 million car not knowing exactly who's going to buy it. They're not like, oh,
Totally.
that one didn't sell.
Well,
They
yeah.
know in
So
advance.
So what's interesting about what you're saying, we did a bunch of this analysis at Guardian Bikes, which is actually where I first met Ben when he was running Drive Point. But we did some deeper LTV analysis. Like obviously we looked at the cohort models, which like you're saying are averages for a given cohort. But we started digging into like order level data and saying people who repeat purchase, what is their behavior? And what we're able to do by analyzing that order level data was we came up with these basically three personas, right? And like I don't remember them all perfectly, but I remember one of them was like there was the family that had multiple kids and what their repeat purchase behavior was. And you could actually see a certain direction that they went through our product catalog, right? And then we were looking at the family that like they're just it's the same kid or kids but they're just graduating through the sizes, right? That was a different persona. And I can't remember what the third one was, but the reason why this was helpful is because if you then go a level deeper and say look at any given month or cohort and say, hey, it appears that we have this many in avatar A that we've acquired in August 2020, and we have this many in avatar, the second avatar. You then have a lot more intelligence about what they might buy next and when, right? And so it's still not a perfect science. And I do want to say something that I think a lot of people get hung up on. All this inventory planning stuff, it's never gonna be a perfect science. But you can use data, right, to lead you in the right direction. And also rule out like cognitive bias. Like cognitive bias is really easy. It's so easy to fall into that trap with inventory planning, and and imperfect data analysis can help you rule out some of those biases that can help you make bad decisions, but it can still lead your ultimately subjective decision in a more objective direction. Like, do you agree and do you see that too?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like a big problem with cognitive bias is the CEO loves their shiny new toy, so they want to order it up, across all the colorways, and then nobody's saying like, I don't think that's a good idea. I think the way that what I'd add to what you said is like if you force everybody to track the bet, like we
Mm-hmm.
thought that this order was going to be bought X% or X number of units by this type of customer and then this type of customer and then this, and then you go back and look at it and you're like, God, we're terrible at this. Like, why don't we understand this better? Then maybe that's what we should be working on improving, as opposed to like, oh, did it work out or not as being the criteria of success. Is like, how good were our predictions? And once you do that, then I think you start making better predictions, and it just forces I think a better conversation. I mean,
Yeah.
I've sat in on these these inventory planning sessions, and it literally is like one opinion of purple versus somebody else's opinion of orange, and you're like, okay.
Yeah, yeah. What you're probably that decision is around the biggest capital outlays that business actually has, right? And so like for it to not be some sort of systematic in some way, right? Data driven in some way, is that you're basically saying like you're going to have no system or process for the biggest capital outlays that an e-com brand is going to make by virtue of being an e-com brand. Yes, that's really really interesting. I do want to. Okay, so I don't know if you have read the book. Let's see, I'm looking at my bookshelf. It's called Future Ready. I read this book a few years ago. It's about forecasting, and it's not like, formula. You're not going through all these formulas and equations. It's actually more about the theory of forecasting. What's the purpose of forecasting? What's the purpose of being right? Goes there, and it goes through a lot of cognitive bias. There's a whole chapter on cognitive bias, and it actually recommends doing the exact thing that you just said, which is tracking all of your forecasts and then graphing what actually happened and what it can reveal. So like let's use inventory as an example. So let's say you place 6 buys a year, you graph your forecast, and then you graph what actually happened on the sales side, on the demand side, right? If you see that your variance, you're consistently over forecasting every single time, then you have some bias in the data. Like statistically, you have a bias that is consistently causing you to over forecast sales. And what it says is that if you're making unbiased forecasts, you should have just as many over projections as you have under projections. So if there's 6 per year, you should be over 3 times and under 3 times. And if you're over or under 4, you're biased in that direction. And the point of this is like to challenge your assumptions. What are the assumptions that are causing us? Assumptions or processes that are causing us to be wrong in a specific direction the majority of the time. And so it's actually a fascinating practice if you do this, because you'll just start realizing like, okay, we have a problem and we need to talk about this as a team to try to figure out how we split the difference on how many times we're over versus how many times we're under.
Yeah, that's right on. And I what I would add to that is, everybody responds to incentives. So oftentimes, the planning team or the inventory ordering team is responding to the incentives set by the CEO or the founder. So like here's a great example is like, the founder gets upset because you've stocked out. Mm-hmm. So what does the team naturally do? It's like, God damn, I'll never stock out again.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then what happens? Like, well, you over order on everything, and then we wonder why we have like 290 days of inventory. And it's like, oh, well, because it's like, great. Now we're circling the drain because like we have winter stuff in summer, we can't get rid of it.
For sure. Well, but what's helpful about that is like if you have a CFO or just like a finance professional like yourself who can help you understand like, look, stocking out, a lot of times the fear of stocking out, generally speaking, freaks out founders because of the obvious P&L impact, lost sales, right? But like if you can help them understand the balance sheet impact of going too far in the other direction and understanding both of those, it's like, okay, well, I can't over optimize for either one of these, stocking out or not stocking out. I've got to figure out how to split the difference here in a thoughtful manner.
If for me, I would rather stock out than overbuy.
Totally.
Because I just think the stock out is a sign of demand. There's this famous, I think it was the somebody from Hermes, I can't remember, but they have this like phrase. It's like, we want to sell 1 unit less than demand. Right. So like, isn't it great? Like it's like, like, look, if you stock out, I mean, you lost out, but like you also have great demand. Like, okay.
Totally. I agree. And I've been on both sides. And I prefer to live to fight another day. There's one other thing that we're circling around in a lot of this discussion, which is like going back to this concept of risk-adjusted bets, right? A risk-adjusted bet a good risk-adjusted bet that a financial professional helps you make in your brand doesn't have an unlimited downside, right? Your downside is limited. And if you, like the place I learned this, I had an old CFO mentor. He was a day trader, and he's like, listen, Jon, I place my stop limits. I place my bets for the day. I can never go to zero because my stop limits keep me from going to zero. So it's all about placing a bet on some range of probable upside, but the downside is not unlimited. That's a bad risk adjusted bet, right? That's a zero sum game. And so like you don't want to think about your inventory management as like, if I don't hit this, I'm going to go out of business. That's a bad inventory decision. I've never seen that be a good inventory decision. The one thing I will say is if you can structure debt properly, I'm saying that like very properly in the right way with the right controls, the right payback period, the right lender, you can use debt strategically, but like don't just think that just because you can put debt in place that will solve your problem, because there's plenty of debt that makes the risk actually even higher of placing those big bets. I want to ask you really quick, what are your thoughts on, I have this opinion that like when a brand can get in touch with predictable repeat purchase and really start to understand it, that reinvesting back into that business becomes less and less risky, right? Because they have this predictability that they're tracking and understand for customers coming back. What is your view on how like understanding and seeing predictable repeat purchase, like how that changes the reinvestment risk of like investing internally versus externally?
Oh man, I mean, it makes a huge difference. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I, going back to what you said at the very beginning of like how do founders build wealth? They should do it through distribution. Like if you think of cash, like one way I think about cash is like you have five mouths to feed, right? You got to pay debt, got to buy inventory, pay for marketing, cover OpEx, and then the fifth mouth is distributions to customer. Well, guess who never gets fed, right? Or
Yeah, the
distribution to
fifth
the
one.
founder, right?
The
Like the
fifth
founder
one,
never
right?
eats. Because
Yeah,
they're like, oh, I'm constantly worried. I can't take money out of the. So once you get the more predictability you can get into your business, and that comes through that repeat purchase, and the more confidence you get in it, then the more likely you are to distribute out to yourself. That's really the goal, And if you're
totally.
constantly have all this volatility, you're never going to distribute. So
Yeah, so like what I want to kind of like tie this all out with is like, I know we've talking about margins, we've been talking a lot about inventory management. The whole reason is if you learn to manage these things the right way, right, to ultimately drive more cash flow, right, which is going to require not just improving profitability, but also keeping your cash conversion cycle under control, which we've defined as basically for an e-com brand, inventory management, right?
yeah,
If you can learn how to pull those levers, you can take more cash out every single month. And why is that important? Because now this is a cash flowing asset, right? That in and of itself is helping you build wealth. You can take that cash, you can buy other assets outside of the business to build additional wealth, or just enjoy that cash flow. And now your entire net worth is not caught up, or is not tied up in what? An exit, which there's just too many market factors that may determine when and how much your brand can sell for. You shouldn't give that dream up, but you should build your business to generate cash flow that you can take out today. That's the ultimate business game, in my opinion. And I'm
yeah,
hoping that we can change, like we can get the message out there that like this is what we should be doing first and foremost.
yeah. I totally agree. And if you do that, you actually build a more sellable business. Because the
Totally.
acquirer comes in and is like, oh, this thing's not a disaster. I can run this thing, you know? It's kicking off a
Totally.
lot of cash. It has much more value to it. So they work
So
together.
I'm curious if you have if like what we've talked about has piqued a brand founder's interest today. What are the first things, like if this is a brand founder that's like, oh, this is a light bulb for me, right? Like this is really interesting. Where's like the first simplest place you think they should look to try to tackle some of the stuff that we've talked about here?
I, if I were that founder, the very first thing I would look at is my free cash flow generation over time. And I think that tells you a lot. Like, to your an earlier question, like, well, I'm profitable, but I don't make any money. I don't have cash. It's like, well, maybe your margins are too low. You know, you need to raise your margins. Maybe you need to work on your cash cycles, but you got to get your free cash flow generation up. I think if free cash flow is harder than profitability,
Totally.
right? So, you know, it's usually a subset of your EBITDA. So, or it always is. So, I think that's the place to start, really understanding that. If they don't understand that, then like, you know, they should be talking to you, or, you know, they can read stuff on at Elephant Herd Consulting or on my knowledge base. But it's like, you got to get that under to tell you where the problems are or where the
Yeah.
improvements are. And then from there, it's just like, I think if it's easier if you keep it simple. It's like, okay, I'm trying to increase margin dollars. I'm trying to increase my ability to uh, get cash converted back into, or excuse me, inventory converted back into cash. Like when you think, even marketing's subject to that. But
Totally.
like your goal with marketing is just to stack up repeat buyers.
Totally.
Why? Because they can convert cash faster and they are higher
Totally.
margin, and like it's not like some goal in and of itself. And then like you do that and you drive more margin dollars. And so it's everything just boils down to those two ideas.
What's the simplest version of like free cash flow, like formula or equation that you can offer a brand founder to try to just understand it in the simplest terms?
The money that's left over after you pay for everything to keep the business going.
Mm.
You know, once you
And
define
what?
it like that, then everybody's like, oh, I can do that in my head. You know, I can do a little
Yeah,
spreadsheet of that. It's like,
totally.
you know, what do you need to, you know, how much inventory do you need to buy? What do you need to cover your, you know, your expenses, your OpEx, and your marketing? And then if you have debt, what do you need to pay for debt? And then what's left over is your free cash flow. Oh, nobody has CapEx. Almost nobody has CapEx. So like, you don't need to.
For sure. Yeah. No, I mean it's important because there's a lot of brands that we see that like have what appears to be a healthy balance in the bank account, right? But we always help them go like, okay, hold on, but how much is due to our vendors in the next 30 days? What's due on the credit cards, right? What are the purchases that are not on the balance sheet, on the liability side of the balance sheet that we know we have to make in cash in the next 30 days? And how much do we owe in sales tax to somebody else, right? And it's like, then what's the number, right? What's left over? That's really a lot closer to the free cash flow that you're talking about, right? Than just looking at your P&L and L and saying I made X
Yeah.
last month in net income, you know?
Yeah, and it's so funny because like a lot of times people have like a very basic spreadsheet of that, or it's like all up in their head. You know, the founders are often very aware of all those like forward
Totally.
expenses, but it's super hard to model it out. Like, well, what if I do this instead of that? And then you need to build in the models. But I think I don't if there's finance and accounting is there's a lot of jargon, and I think people get lost in the jargon and the formulas as opposed to like, well, what is the concept that I'm really trying to
Totally.
do here?
Dude, there's a huge problem out there. I think the more complicated a finance person, you can be in any world, I don't care what vertical you're in. If you have a finance person trying to sell you something and speak to you in terms that just sound really complicated and can't help you break it down, it's something to be wary of because there's so many people in the finance world that profit off of sounding really smart, right? And by the way, they probably are really smart, but the reality is how do you turn these concepts into action, right? Turn the potential into actual kinetics that actually make your business financially healthier and ultimately help you build wealth. I just want to say this one last time here before we kind of land the plane is like you should be building your business to create wealth for you. Like that's the whole point of a business, right? Like or
Right.
else it's just a expensive hobby, right? And selling the business is not the only way to create wealth. You should figure out how to maximize cash flow that you can distribute to yourself. And we've gone through a bunch of I think really really helpful stuff here for helping you think about where you might be able to start or ask for support. So before we do end here though, Ben, I'm curious. I asked this to most of my guests. You already mentioned something about being a writer for Disney, which I think is cool. But what's a little known fact about Ben that people might find shocking or surprising?
I don't know that it would be all that shocking or surprising, I guess, but um, I've gotten really into, it sounds so crazy, But I've gotten really into like taking care of my property, and that involves like cutting down lots of trees. And I just like it's unbelievably fun. I mean, it's like such a grind. Like figure out like, okay, what's gonna happen with this tree, and then you break out the chainsaws and like
Which
I've
way is
gotten
it
a
gonna go?
fucking
Which way is it
trouble.
gonna
I'm like,
fall?
oh yeah, I'm like, oh my god, it's like going the wrong way. Like, so it's like a constant physics problem that I just find. And then you like take it down and you cut it up and you chop it up, and you stack it. And I'm like, every time I make a fire, I'm like, oh, I remember cutting that one down.
I love
So
that, man.
excited.
That's super awesome. When you did share earlier about being a writer for a minute for Disney and then be like, oh, I don't want to do that. I thought I used to be in a heavy metal band that put out one record, went on tour right after business school, and I did it for like a year and a half. I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. Like I'm a musician. I still play music to this day, but I was like, that's not what I want to do for a living. And I went back to startups after that. But so I can relate to you in that regard.
Yeah, it's a brutal entertainment is just like, I mean, you talk about like fate not being in your hands. I mean,
Yeah, 100%.
it's like, I don't want
It
to be 60 years old and be like, well, I once did something.
for sure. That's about how I felt like with trying to make it as as a touring metal musician for sure, man.
Yeah.
Well, Ben, I appreciate you coming on, man. This was
Thank you.
a fun conversation. I don't get to have a lot of finance nerds on the show with me, so this was really great. If people want to learn more about Elephant Herd or you get in touch with you to see how you can help them, where can they find you?
Elephant Herd Consulting.com. Sign up for the newsletter there. I have a knowledge base where I write, all the stuff that I find interesting about brand finance. That's probably the best place. You can find me on Twitter or X and LinkedIn, but the site has the most stuff.
Definitely check out Ben's site. I've definitely perused it and read a few articles. So
Oh, nice.
great
Thanks.
content on there. And yeah, don't forget if you want more helpful tips on scaling your profit focused D2C brand, you can always follow me, Jon Blair, on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in learning more about how Free to Grow CFO can help your brand increase profit and cash flow as you scale, check us out at freetogrowcfo.com. Until next time, scale on. And thanks for joining, Ben.
Thanks, John.